Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Class 3 of the JCSVV Adult Education Program, Sephardic Jewry and the Golden Age of Spain. In our first two classes, Richard Whitland and I discussed the history of Jews on the Iberian Peninsula, including the early Visigoths, the Muslim conquest in the 8th century, and the blossoming of Jewish-Muslim relations from the 8th through the 10th century, the Golden Age. We discussed the hostility of the church to Jews, the increasing violence of Spanish Christians towards Jews, and the many forced conversions. In the 1400s, the Spanish Reconquista conquered the last Muslim cities in Spain. The Spanish rulers, along with the church, established the Inquisition to root out heresy or Judaizing among converted Jews who were called New Christians. We learned that the Inquisition was a failure, and in 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, along with Grand Inquisitor Torquemada, decided to expel all Jews from Spain so as to remove any opportunity for new Christians to consort or Judaize with Jews. This week, we pick up with the decision of the Spanish monarchs to expel the Jews. Let's first examine the significance of the Edict of Expulsion, also known as the Alhambra Decree. In the 15th century, Jewish Spain, or Sepharad, was the largest Jewish center in the world. Jews had lived here for 1,500 to 2,000 years. They came before the Muslims, and they came before the Christians. According to some estimates, almost 1/3 of all Jews in the world lived on the Iberian Peninsula. This rivaled the number of Jews living in the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East. Expelling these people was a catastrophe for the Jewish people. Let's look at the Edict of Expulsion. Next video, please.
It all began with this notorious document, the Alhambra Decree, which will forever live in the memories of Jews. The King and Queen of Spain issued it less than 3 months after the surrender of Granada, the last remaining Spanish territory in Muslim hands. In it, Jews were accused of trying to subvert the Holy Catholic faith and ordered to convert to Christianity or leave the country. They were given just 3 months, and the punishment for any Jew who did not convert or leave by the deadline was death without trial.
The edict went public in April 1492. No Jew was permitted to remain within the Spanish kingdom. Any Jew who wished to convert was welcome to stay. Whether a Jew was rich or poor did not matter. They all had to convert or leave under penalty of death. Spain had the largest and most cultured Jewish population in Europe. The Spanish expulsion decimated that population. Jews had 3 months to get rid of their property and leave, or keep their property and stay. Jews were expelled from Spain on Tisha B'Av, the same day of the year on which the destruction of the first and second temples occurred. 1492 was also the year that Christopher Columbus left Spain and discovered the New World. Was Christopher Columbus a crypto-Jew?
A number of conversos or new Christians accompanied Christopher Columbus on the first of his 4 voyages on the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria as it departed the port of Palos. And we know at least one of them, quite famously, Luis de Torres, the interpreter or translator, told us in his diary, quote, "The exiles of Sepharad descended to the Mediterranean, searching for passage to a new land where they could openly practice Judaism. I was among them, and I agreed to accompany Columbus because I hoped to find Jewish brethren. We were a large group of conversos living in perpetual fear of the Inquisition." And so the presence of Luis de Torres and other conversos has led many individuals over the ages to speculate as to the religious identity of Christopher Columbus himself. We don't know with certainty whether or not he was a crypto-Jew, but there's extremely strong circumstantial evidence to believe that he was a descendant of Sepharad. The late Estelle Irizarry, in her work, Christopher Columbus, the DNA of his writings, makes quite a compelling case. We know that although Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colon, as he was known, was officially from Genoa, Italy, he did not speak Italian. He communicated in Catalan or Castilian, perhaps a form of Ladino. Letters to his sons famously have an acronym at the top left, which is BH, short for the Hebrew phrase Bezrat Hashem, with the help or assistance of God, that many observant Jews continue to put at the top of their letters or emails to this very day. In his last will and testament, Columbus left money to a Jew in Lisbon, and he left money to orphan young girls for their dowries, a traditional Jewish bequest across the ages. And most famously, Columbus delayed the departure of the first voyage from Palos by a day, so as to not coincide with Tisha B'Av, the great day of lamentation on the Jewish calendar. Along with Luis de Torres, a number of members of this crew of 90 to 120 men came from places with longstanding Jewish communities throughout Castile and Aragon. And he was financed and backed by leading conversos, among them Luis de San Angel, as seen on the left, and Gabriel Sanchez. And so even if Christopher Columbus himself was not a descendant of Sepharad or crypto Jew, he certainly lived and operated and was supported by a Jewish and converso milieu.
Was the expulsion inevitable? Catherine and Ferdinand were the power couple of the age. Their children married into royal houses across Europe. Recall that their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, was the first wife of King Henry VIII of England. The monarchs wanted to build a pure Spain with one language and one religion. They and the church turned the Reconquista of Spain into an almost religious experience. Jews were in the way and had to be expelled. Spain and Spanish became synonymous with being Christian. People still say, hablo cristiano, I speak Christian, instead of I speak Spanish. Why do some Jews convert rather than leave Iberia? Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to those who decided to convert in 1492 and take a look at the factors that would have triggered their decisions to stay in Spain. First, it seems to have been family. As we can document in the case of Abraham Señor and others, if your parents converted, you probably converted to stay with them. Family groups tended to convert together. Secondly, finances were an issue. Jews were not allowed to take gold or silver with them when they left Spain. And since they were given only a few months to dispose of their properties, wealthier people faced significant financial losses if they left. Did they convert to protect property and businesses and avoid catastrophic economic losses? On the other end of the economic spectrum, I wonder if some of the poor could have been trapped because they did not have funds to make an international move or leave Spain. So finances became a factor. Third was miscalculation. Some Jews might have thought that the expulsion would be short-term, as had happened previously in France and other countries, thinking that they could convert and wait it out until Jews were allowed back in the country. Many of them, like Jews in Germany in the 1930s, must have miscalculated or misunderstood about what was to come. Did the more pessimistic leave because they thought the worst could happen, and the more optimistic stay because they never believed it could get as bad as it did? A fourth factor in the conversion must have been feigned conversions, thinking that they could continue their Jewish practice in secret, in hiding from the Inquisition. Maimonides had written the Epistle on Martyrdom, providing the theological support for false conversions. He advocated that rather than die, a Jew should feign conversion to save his or her life and then move as soon as possible to a safer place to resume life as a practicing Jew. For the feigned conversion principle to work, Jewish converts would have had to leave Spain and Portugal soon and move to a place where they could resume living as Jews, or their children would assimilate and Jewish practice would be lost. As the reality of life under the Inquisition became more apparent, tens of thousands did leave Spain and Portugal in the 1500s, and and they moved then to reclaim their lives as openly practicing Jews.
The persecution and mass expulsion of Jews from Spain and Portugal hurt the Spanish economy. Jews were literate and had better number skills than the Catholic majority. They had highly skilled urban occupations. After the Jewish expulsion, Spain also began to convert and expel Muslims. The last Muslim expulsion was in 1614. In the 16th century, Spain rose as the riches from its New World colonies cushioned the shocks of these expulsions. But by expelling all its Jews and Muslims, the people with knowledge, Spain's economy and intellectual activities slowly declined. In 1898, Spain lost its last colonies, Puerto Rico and Cuba, to the United States, and this represented the end of the Spanish Empire. So where did the Sephardim go after the expulsion of 1492? About 200,000 left Spain. About half, or 100,000, crossed the border to Portugal. Many of those were conversos who thought they could return to Judaism in Portugal. Next video, please.
And so now we return, ladies and gentlemen, to where we left off in 1492, Iberia last time. The Inquisition was instrumental under the leadership of Tomás de Torquemada in procuring the Alhambra Decree, which shattered the unity of Sepharad. Individuals or Sephardic Jews who left Spain and went to North Africa or across the Mediterranean, throughout the Levant, in the Near East, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, on and up into Turkey, into Southeastern Europe, into the Balkans, became known as North African Sephardim and Eastern Sephardim. Sephardic Jews who remained on the Iberian Peninsula, who turned west and entered the neighboring kingdom of Portugal, as we shall see, but eventually reverted to Judaism when the opportunity availed itself. Once they left Iberia, became known as Western Sephardim, and Jews who were effectively compelled to convert to Christianity and were unable or unwilling to revert to Judaism. Their descendants, of course, are referred to as the B'nai Anusim, the children or descendants of the forced or coerced one.
Next slide, please. Let's look at this map
In
again.
Europe, Ashkenazi Jews found safety with the Ottomans after mass expulsions from Hungary and France in the 14th century, followed by a wave of Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal fleeing the Inquisition in the 15th century. Jewish European immigrants intermingled with the Romanian Jews of the former Byzantine Empire and Mizrahi Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, who were already living under Ottoman control. The Sultan scoffed at the Spanish for expelling the community, saying the king has impoverished his own country and enriched mine. They brought useful skills, often acting as translators and diplomats. Ottoman Jews built vast international trade networks, some even growing rich as they capitalized on trade through the Silk Road. Jews also brought skills with medicine and finance, becoming bankers, doctors, and political advisors. One Italian Jew even became the personal physician of the Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror. While many Jews worked closely with Muslims, others formed semi-independent communities. After the Ottomans conquered Palestine in 1516 by defeating the Egyptian Mamluk Sultanate, brilliant Kabbalist mystics like Rabbi Isaac Luria and Rabbi Haim Vital made their home in the sacred city of Safed, as did Rabbi Joseph Caro, the visionary author of the Shulchan Aruch. Meanwhile, an influx of Sephardic immigration to the city of Salonika in Ottoman-ruled Greece transformed it into the only city in the world with a Jewish majority at the time. In fact, by the mid-16th century, nearly half of all Jews lived in the Ottoman Empire. Jews and Muslims in the Ottoman Empire thrived together during the 15th and 16th centuries, but the relatively good times couldn't last. Starting in 1699, Austrian and Russian conquest chipped away at Ottoman control, while the colonial empires of Western Europe opened new shipping lanes with America and East Asia that threatened the primacy of the Silk Road. These changes plunged many Jewish communities into poverty, erasing much of the wealth they had built in more prosperous years. Meanwhile, as Ottoman Jews found their home and livelihood under siege, Jews in Europe thrived. Wealth and medical advancements enabled the Jewish population of Europe to nearly triple from 1800 to 1880, while the Ottoman Jewish population stagnated.
The Ottoman Sultan mocked the Spanish rulers for giving away their most valuable resource, the Jews, who brought their skills and knowledge to his empire. In 1492, the Sultan sent his navy across the Mediterranean to Spain to carry the Jews to the Ottoman Empire. He ordered all Ottoman governors to accept Jews. The arrival of Eastern Sephardim in the Ottoman Empire spurred a mixing of ancient Jewish cultures.
And so, as tragic as this, of course, decree of expulsion was, in some sense, however, it actually provided a reunion, because the Sephardim who left encountered, when they came throughout the Mediterranean, seeking new worlds in which to perpetuate Sepharad, they encountered pre-existing Jewish communities, the Greek and Romanio Jews, who had been there since the time of the Byzantine Empire, perhaps even as early as Alexander the Great, the Roman or Italian Jews on the peninsula since the time of the Maccabees, the Hashmonaim, the Mustarabim, the Jews in Arab countries, Kafkazim, Jews of the Caucasus, Temanim, Jews of Yemen, and Ashkenazim.
Next video, please.
Even after 1492, because of course those secret Jews might still be there. Many Jews, by the way, simply go west. They move into Portugal, which is right next door, and a different king. But in 1497, they're forcibly converted there too, and they're not allowed to leave. And so that's where you really get a large body of secret Jews who might call themselves conversos, but actually maintain a positive secret Jewish identity. And they're ultimately only allowed to leave in the 1500s. And many of them go for former Spanish colonies or other territories that might be comfortable for them. And this begins a Sephardic dispersion, where they wind up in Amsterdam, where, for example, Baruch Spinoza is from. They wind up in Spain. They wind up in the Ottoman Empire, specifically in Istanbul and in a town called, back then, Salonika. Today it's Thessaloniki, which actually, Salonika, the Sephardic Jews speaking Spanish, become the largest of the different communities living there. There may be 40% of the population is Sephardic, about 30% is Muslim, and 30% is Greek Orthodox. And the Jews are in charge of the port. They're not only, by the way, the shippers and merchants, as we might expect, they're also the schleppers and the pickpockets. And they represent like the manual labor too, so much so that the port of Salonika closed on Shabbat because there weren't any laborers to unload the ships because they all spoke, and they were all these Sephardic Jews. But this is Sephardicness in diaspora, where they keep speaking medieval Spanish, Ladino. They keep calling their synagogues the Cordoba Synagogue and the Toledo Synagogue and the New Toledo Synagogue because they left the old Toledo Synagogue because they had an argument about something. I mean, again, what else is new in organized Jewish life? But their identity is as Sephardic Jews with their roots back in Spain and looking back at the sort of golden period. But there's also an interesting legacy in that Marrano community, the Converso community, of the Converso experience. So let's say you were a Converso family living in Portugal, and you're sending your kid to school, which is, of course, a Catholic school. And you're telling your kid, don't believe everything the priest is telling you. Well, guess what happens 10 years later when you manage to move to Amsterdam and you can come out of the closet as Jews and you can rejoin the organized Jewish community. And your kid comes home from school and says, well, I didn't believe everything the rabbi told me. You see the pattern? You've learned to question. These Sephardic Jews also read the Bible without the filter of rabbinic Judaism. So the rabbis tell them when they come out of the closet in Amsterdam, well, you have to have separate dishes for milk and meat. And they say, where did you get that? That's nowhere in the Bible. Because again, they'd experienced, their Judaism was looking back at the text, but without the rabbinic interpretations. So they maintain some practices and not other ones.
Let's take a look at how Sephardic Jews lived in the Greek city of Salonika, which was under Ottoman control.
The city had the largest Jewish population in the Balkans. Most were descendants of Jews who had been expelled from Spain in the 16th century. They still spoke a form of Spanish known as Ladino, and they maintained their distinctive customs and styles of dress.
The upper-class Jewish women of Salonika were noted for their finery. They had preserved traditions that they had brought with them from Spain, so they liked to go around with sort of fur-lined tunics or cloaks, as in fact the men did, and with their hair grown long, a bit like some kind of medieval court dress. The Jewish community, which was very large, covered the gamut from poor barefoot street urchins to some of the wealthiest individuals in the empire.
Leon's pictures are a poignant reminder of the Jewish communities that were once such a vibrant part of Balkan life.
This is a map showing the roots of Jewish immigration to Salonika. For centuries, it seemed that all roads led to Salonika. Salonika was known as the Jerusalem of the Balkans. Jews from Spain, southern Italy, and Portugal sought refuge here, and the majority of the population was Jewish. The city's Jewish community was primarily Sephardic. Here is a plaque of a synagogue established in 1537 by a Sephardic family. Note the Hebrew on the right side of the plaque and the Greek on the left side of the plaque. In the 19th century, Salonika in Greece was one of the most Jewish cities in Europe and had a Jewish majority. And there were 32 synagogues in Salonika. Salonika began to decline in 1917 when a great fire destroyed the Jewish quarter of the city. What was left of the Jewish population of Salonika was destroyed in World War I and then again by the Nazis and the Holocaust. The Eastern Sephardim, who migrated around the Eastern Mediterranean, spoke Ladino, the language of Spanish Jews. Ladino did not become a Jewish language until several decades after the expulsion from Spain in 1492. When Jews were expelled from Iberia, they were cut off from further development of Spanish. So Ladino uses the medieval Spanish grammar and vocabulary of the 14th and 15th century, along with many borrow words from Hebrew, Arabic, Greek, Turkish, Bulgarian, and others. Ladino was once the Jewish language of trade throughout the Adriatic Sea, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Western Sephardim, who went to Amsterdam or England, were in continuous contact with Spain as merchants, and therefore they spoke modern Castilian Spanish. Today, Ladino is under threat of extinction because the Nazis destroyed most Ladino-speaking communities in Europe. After World War II, many Ladino speakers emigrated to Latin America and assimilated modern Spanish, while others adopted the language of whatever country they ended up in. Israel is now the country with the largest number of Ladino speakers, with about 200,000 people who still speak or understand the language. Historically, Ladino was written in Hebrew letters, but today Ladino, like Spanish, is written with the modern Latin alphabet. The next video features a Salonika resident speaking Ladino and discussing the fact that there are few Ladino speakers left. If you're familiar with modern Spanish, you may be able to understand what he is saying. Subtitles are hopefully turned on to better understand his message. Next video.
Mi familia ella mismo es de Salonique. Parece que las raíces de nuestra familia son de Mallorca, que vinimos aquí o antes de 1492 o después de 1492, no se sabe exactamente. Nuestra patria estuvo siempre la ciudad de Salonique y no la nación, porque aquí antes habían los bizantios, los romeos, los bizantios, los griegos.
In addition to language, Eastern Sephardim absorbed the music of their surrounding cultures. Here is a Sephardic song from Sarajevo in Bosnia, which is in the Balkans. It has an Arabic beat, a klezmer sound, and Ladino words. The singer uses an Arabic instrument, the oud. The song was titled, "Oh, My Mother, If I Die." Next.
Madre mía, si me muero, Hazanim no quiero yo, si no se mansevicas adelantre el miaron alba shekerola alba shekerola alba shekerola alba shekerola.
Many Sephardim went to Italy. So let's look again at the roots of Eastern migration into the Mediterranean following the expulsion from Spain. Next slide, please. At the time of the expulsion in 1492, most Italian Jews lived in Sicily. And we see here the small numbers of Jews living in the north and the body of Italy, but in Sicily, there's 25,000. But the influence of the Spanish crowd was great. Sicily, along with the southern kingdom of Naples, belonged to Spain. And so Jews were also expelled from Sicily and Naples in 1492. After 1541, there were no more Jews in southern Italy, including Sicily and Naples. All you see are the numbers in the north. For some Sephardic Jews, Italy was just a temporary stopover on their way to the final destination. Some went east to the Ottoman Empire, some went north to Amsterdam and London, some went south to North Africa. Let's look again at the map to see the Western Sephardic migration after the expulsion. We see the black lines to the west of Europe, which are the routes of migration of the Western Sephardim after the expulsion. The Western Sephardic routes along the Atlantic coast to Northern Europe and to the Americas developed about a century later than the Eastern Sephardic migration routes in the Mediterranean. The first place the Western Sephardim went was west to Portugal. It was close, no sea voyage, and it had similar customs as their Spanish homeland. And the Portuguese king recognized that Jews would be an economic benefit to Portugal. He was willing to get rid of Judaism, but he did not want to get rid of his Jews. In this next 5-minute video, we will examine the Western Sephardim's expulsion from Spain in 1492 and their experience in Portugal.
Going into 1492, half of the Spanish exiles or Jews who left Spain after the Alhambra decree or edict of expulsion was issued turned west and entered the neighboring kingdom of Portugal. Similar culture, similar climate, similar language. King João II effectively welcomed them in. 600 wealthy Jews, however, had to pay an exorbitant bribe to settle in Portugal. All others had to pay some entrance fee in order to have the privilege of remaining in the country for up to 8 months. After this date, if they could not pay, they could be pressed into slavery, but at least they would be able to profess Judaism. The historian Maria Ferro Tavares has estimated, as an aside, that the native Jewish population of Portugal in 1492 was 30,000. And so João II did press the Jews after that 8-month period elapsed into slavery. And in a further act of cruelty, he abducted about 2,000 Jewish children or so and exiled them to the Portuguese island of São Tomé off the coast of West Africa in an attempt to compel their parents to convert to Christianity. João died in 1495, and his successor, Manuel I, appeared benevolent. He freed the Jews who had been pressed into slavery, but he sought to wed the Infanta Isabella, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. And as a precondition of the marital union, they mandated that Manuel issue his own edict of expulsion. Reluctantly, it appears he did this. In December of 1496, he ordered all professing Jews, Spanish refugees, and native Portuguese Jews alike to convert to Catholicism or leave the Portuguese dominions by October of 1497. He then alternated between carrot and stick, beginning with the stick. In March of 1497, he ordered all Jewish children under the age of 14 to be forcibly baptized, hoping that their parents would follow suit. And then the carrot came in May of 1497, when he gave effectively a 20-year grace period for Jews to convert, to become new Christians or Christos Novos. He forbade any inquiry, any inquisition, so to speak, into their religious beliefs and actions, but neither carrot nor stick seemed to work. And it's estimated that 20,000 Jews or so wished to depart Portugal as they had Spain 5 years earlier. It has to be remembered that the Jews who went into Portugal from Spain were among the most steadfast remnant of those who wished to retain their ancestral faith and tradition, so they would not submit to baptism so easily. In May and June of 1497, about 20,000 Jews or so converged on Lisbon to leave. Manuel had promised them ships, but when they came to the palace of the Estaus, or the Paço dos Estaus, there were no ships to be seen. Portuguese monks forcibly baptized all Jews, throwing baptismal water over them, instantly creating them new Christians, or Cristãos Novos. Manuel went further. He then ordered synagogues and Jewish schools closed, religious paraphernalia such as ritual objects, tefillin or phylacteries, mezuzot, and Jewish books confiscated, and apparently it seems gave the order for Jewish cemeteries to be destroyed. He then, in 1499, forbade conversos, or new Christians, from leaving Portugal because he feared that they would revert to Judaism if they left the country. And so for these series of actions, which was an attempted extirpation of memory, damnatio memoriae, it's known, Maria Ferro Tavares, as you can see in the photo, has labeled this religiocide, the attempted annihilation of a faith. And so this gives us a key distinction, ladies and gentlemen, between Spain and Portugal, between the Jewish experience as to how it effectively ended. In Spain, there were numerous waves of conversion that occurred over the centuries, beginning with the conversions under the Visigothic king Sigismund. And there were new Christian communities existing side by side, openly professing Jewish ones. In Portugal, there was nothing like that. Tens of thousands of Jews, the entire normative Jewish community, was baptized rather violently and forcefully en masse. They became new Christians effectively overnight. Nonetheless, by the end of the 15th century, it is not inaccurate to say that because of these reasons, Judaism as a living, breathing, organic faith no longer officially existed on the Iberian Peninsula.
So over the years, Hebrew was lost to these people, along with the prayers and songs. If you were found with a Hebrew book, then you were sent to the Inquisition. Jews read the Hebrew Bible as it was translated into Christian Spanish, because they no longer knew Hebrew and no longer had access to Hebrew books. Sephardic Jews lived centuries without Talmud and without rabbinic interpretation of Torah. So Judaism was forced underground. Next video.
And because of that, the people of the book, the term for which is usually applied to Jews, became people of memory. Something we'll speak about in greater detail next time is that Judaism at this point went underground and became crypto-Judaism, effectively became oral transmission of knowledge, with communal institutions shut down, no synagogue, study halls, or teachers. Women took up the mantle and proceeded to transmit the rituals and the knowledge to the next generation. And trial records, even in the Tribunal of Toledo, up to 1520, show that 3/4 of all teachers of crypto-Judaism were women, were conversos. Again, something we'll speak about in greater detail next time.
Thank you. Many of the Sephardim who were expelled from Spain in 1492 insisted upon staying Jewish and had migrated to Portugal. In 1496, before they were forcibly baptized, the Jewish community of Portugal was the strongest and most educated Jewish group in the world. The Jews who had entered Portugal were the cream of the Jewish crop and included many great rabbis and Jewish leaders. So the forced mass conversion of Jews in 1497 did not have the desired effect the king expected. These Jews were steadfast in their desire to remain Jewish, and so these originally Spanish Jews now became Portuguese crypto-Jews.
The forcible conversion that Manuel effected had the opposite of the intended effect, because sanctified principles are not easily discarded. The number of insincere converts, perhaps not surprisingly, drastically increased, and the Inquisition would not come to Portugal for another 40 years. So because the Portuguese new Christians had just been forcibly converted from Judaism, but were that steadfast remnant who clung strenuously to their ancestral faith and traditions. And the fact they had decades to acclimate to their newfound faith in society meant that Portuguese crypto-Judaism entrenched itself much further than it was ever allowed to get in Spain.
Crypto-Jews were hated in Portugal as they were in Spain. In 1506, during an Easter service, people thought they saw a miracle in a church. But a new Christian said it was only a reflection of light and not a miracle. In response, an angry mob killed the new Christian and then attacked and burned to death from 2,000 to 4,000 new Christians in Lisbon. Iberian people were paranoid and obsessed with their lineage and purity of blood. 100 years after the Lisbon massacre, Miguel Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, wrote a one-act play poking fun at the Iberian paranoia about purity of blood. It is titled The Stage of Wonders. The play is reminiscent of the Emperor's New Clothes.
And Cervantes, one of my favorite writers, Karen knows this. Cervantes writes a lot about the level of ridiculousness that this obsession gets to. There is one famous literary work, if you don't mind, I'll get a little distracted and tell you this one. Entremes, this is a little theatrical play in one act. There's one where people come and say, all right, we're going to set a play where it's all magic, and only those who are of pure blood, that is to say of pure Christian Catholic heritage, only those of pure blood will be able to see what's going on. And of course, they were just liars. They were trying to get money. So they get the people from the village and they start saying, oh, now you can see some sun, and now you can see all these biblical characters. You can see the big flood and so on and so forth. And everyone was like, wow, yeah, this is so great. I can't believe my eyes. No one was seeing anything. Everyone was scared that they will be perceived as a non-pure blood, which would be a great shame and a great dishonor. What happens is that someone from outside of the context comes running in and sees everyone just wowing and being in awe of these things that's happening that he couldn't see. And he's like, what are you talking about? I can't see anything. And then there is an attack and people kind of kill each other because of this. So this is showing the ridiculousness of this obsession, the paranoia of people with this pure blood idea.
In 1507, 1 year after the Lisbon massacre, King Manuel of Portugal changed course and allowed new Christians to leave Portugal. But after King Manuel died in 1521, his son established the Portuguese Inquisition. And the first auto de fe in Portugal happened in 1540. After 1540, all liberties and protections that King Manuel had granted to new Christians were rescinded, and the Portuguese Inquisition continued with its work, persecuting new Christians. Things came to a head in 1580, when Spain and Portugal united.
In 1580, a dramatic development occurred when the Iberian Union happened. Spain and Portugal effectively entered dynastic union under Philip II of Spain, who became Philip I of Portugal. This was the same Philip who sent the Spanish Armada against Protestant England in 1588. The Inquisitions remained separate from one another, but they were effectively united in the person of the king. What's fascinating is the Spanish Inquisition, which seems to have grown relatively no longer prosecuting crypto-Jews. It seems to have gone dormant in this regard by the mid-1500s, revived its persecution. Why? Because when Spain and Portugal unified in this union, the borders opened and thousands of Portuguese new Christians crossed the border into Castile and eventually onto Europe and around the world. And so trial records from the Spanish Inquisition show this revived persecution of Judaizers or crypto-Jews, and fascinatingly, most of the accused were Portuguese new Christians.
So the Portuguese Inquisition perpetuated Jewish identity. It expelled Judaism, but not the Jews. Jean Paul Sartre had said that anti-Semitism created the Jew. And now it is asserted that the Inquisition created crypto-Jews through constant reminders of their heritage. And it was the experience of the Inquisition that made them into a cohesive group. After a forced or insincere baptism, Portuguese Jews often changed their names to better blend into the Christian population. Here is a sampling of pre-expulsion Sephardic last names. And you can see these lists are the typical names of people who lived in Spain at that time. These are Spanish names after expulsion, Sephardic names. After the expulsion, the new Christian names are indistinguishable from old Christian names because they are the same. New Christians took old Christian names to blend in beyond suspicion. If you said you were a good Christian, but your name, for example, was Shimon ben Shmuel, you were certain to get on the Inquisitor's radar. So after 3 or 4 generations, more and more crypto-Jews assimilated completely. So by the year 1600, the number of Spanish Inquisition cases dropped dramatically, and many new Christians had already left Iberia for the New World and elsewhere. So how is someone able to stay a crypto-Jew for so long? What did crypto-Jews believe in that gave them the strength to be a Jew in secret for so many years?
And so Gitlitz and other scholars, though, looking at the crypto-Jews, the ones who strove to remain faithful to their fathers, they are defined as Catholics without faith and or Jews without knowledge. Now, it has to be remembered, the milieu in which these crypto-Jews lived for centuries was one permeated with Catholicism. It was inconceivable to be anything other than a Catholic. Daily language and discourse, one's mental universe, even the physical landscape were replete with Catholic imagery, such as the cross, the Virgin Mary, the baby Jesus, etc. And so Gitlitz, after scouring these inquisitorial records in Spain, Portugal, and overseas colonies, identifies 5 core principles that it seems all crypto-Jews clung to, even in the absence of all else. They fervently believed, number 1, in monotheism. They rejected the Trinitarian conception of the Godhead as espoused in Catholicism. They believed in the law of Moses, that it had not been abrogated, that it remained intact. Belief alone, however, was insufficient. They believed that observance of the rituals, the commandments, or the mitzvot was required as well. And although they acknowledged that perhaps there was more than one way to reach God, Judaism was the preferred faith. And lastly, and extraordinarily significantly, they categorically rejected the claim of Jesus' messiahship. They believed, as Judaism does, that the Messiah has not yet come.
In the 16th and 17th centuries, many crypto-Jews left Portugal, individually or in small groups. They were educated and had worldly knowledge. Migration had begun in Spain since the pogroms of 1391. So by this time, the crypto-Jews had relatives in all ports, which made it easy to travel. By the end of the 16th century, if you were a Portuguese merchant anywhere in Europe or anywhere in the New World, it was just assumed that you were a Jew. But as Portuguese crypto-Jews traveled the globe, the Inquisition followed them.
And they became known as men of the nation, La Nación, or Homens do Nosso. In fact, so many Portuguese New Christians left Portugal to fan out across Europe and eventually to the New World, something we will speak about in greater detail next time, that the very term Portuguese became synonymous with crypto-Jew or Judaizer. And one of the most extraordinary developments in history, the Portuguese New Christians who went to many of these great cities of Europe and to southern France, into the Italian city-states, Venice, Ferrara, Leghorn, or Livorno, and on and up to the Protestant-ruled cities of Hamburg, Amsterdam, and London, reverted to Judaism and founded Spanish and Portuguese synagogues and communities, becoming the Western Sephardim. And it's fascinating that it was Portuguese New Christians who restored and effectively resurrected a Jewish presence in great parts of Europe, centuries after massacres, expulsions, and conversions had occurred. Now, while Portuguese New Christians fled around the globe seeking refuge and respite from the Inquisition, it wasn't long before the Inquisition circled the globe looking for them. And they proceeded to establish branches or subsidiary versions of themselves in their overseas colonies, particularly in the New World. Spain established tribunals in Mexico City, which effectively governed Mexico, New Mexico, the future United States, Panama, and even the Philippines across the Pacific Ocean. They established a tribunal in Lima, which governed Spanish South America until 1610, when one came to be established in Cartagena in Colombia, which oversaw Colombia, Venezuela, and the Caribbean. The Portuguese established a rather infamous tribunal at Goa in India to oversee its colonial possessions in Africa and Asia. And the Portuguese empowered the bishop in Bahia, then serving as the capital of Portuguese Brazil, to identify and extradite suspected heretics, especially crypto-Jews, back to Lisbon to stand trial. So Portugal maintained.
Goa was a Portuguese colony on the west coast of India. Here we see the name Goa at the very right, the very west on this. It was halfway around the world, and many new Christians fled there to escape persecution. But the Inquisition came there and was especially brutal. Enlightenment figures began to criticize the Inquisition. In Peru and Mexico, the Inquisition lasted from the 1570s to 1820.
The Mexican Inquisition came in 1571, but the largest auto de fe, or act of faith, ever staged in New Spain or Nueva España occurred in 1649. Over 100 heretics were accused of practicing crypto-Judaism. 14 people were relaxed or burnt, and 57 people who died had their bones exhumed to show that even in death, one could not escape the reach of inquisitors. Perhaps the most famous martyr at this execution after the auto de fe occurred was Tomas Trevino de Sobremonte. He refused to recant, he refused to accept the mercy of the church, and he resolved to die in the law of Moses, and so he was burnt alive at the stake. He was later eulogized as a martyr for the Jewish faith. And we know that people came from over 50 miles to witness this auto de fe because, again, by this time period, the mid-17th century, it had become once in a lifetime spectacle. Today, the Palace of the Inquisition, as you can see in the photo, is on the campus of a university, UNAM, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and it houses the Museum of Mexican Medicine. And this plaque, of course, marks the quemadero, the great place of execution or burnings.
In 1821, the Portuguese Inquisition ended. In 1834, the Spanish Inquisition ended. In the first 2 centuries of the Spanish Inquisition, about 44,000 cases were brought before the Inquisition. In the first 2 centuries of the Portuguese Inquisition, about 40,000 cases were brought in Portugal, and 16,000 cases were brought in Goa, India. It is estimated that more than 1 million people had to answer questions about their religious beliefs, even if they did not actually go to trial before the Inquisition. The Iberian Inquisition was a global reign of terror.
The Iberian Inquisition was truly a global reign of terror, or an institution of persecution. They occupied or governed jurisdictionally all the Americas, including in the future United States. They came throughout the African continent into Sao Tome, where the Jewish children had once been exiled by João II, into Luanda and Angola, and it lapped the shores of the Indian Ocean into Mozambique, to the western coast of India, to Goa and Cochin, even into the Straits of Hormuz, to the Persian Gulf, and it came to the Far East, to Macau, Manila in the Philippines, and Malacca, by Singapore, by Indonesia. And so there are very few places where crypto-Jews could flee to find refuge and respite from the worldwide arm of the Inquisition. Moreover, the geographical and really generational scope of persecution was unprecedented. People were extradited thousands of miles across oceans to justify their religious beliefs. And this went on for nearly 3.5 centuries on 5 continents.
One of the worst legacies of this period were the racial purity laws, which were later carried over by the Nazis. The purity of blood laws were finally abolished in Portugal in 1773 and in Spain in 1860. The Edict of Expulsion, the Alhambra Decree, was abolished in 1968. The Netherlands was the first country in the Western world to establish a policy of religious tolerance, and this made Amsterdam a magnet for new Christians leaving Portugal.
Now, a few decades later, Portuguese new Christians arrived in the great city on the Amstel in Northern Europe, now, of course, known as Amsterdam. but they were worshiping in the privacy of their homes. In 1615 or 16, they established a modus vivendi, an agreement with the fledgling Dutch Republic, which had proclaimed its independence from Spain a few decades earlier. In return for being able to openly profess Judaism, they could not threaten the integrity of the body politic. They could not challenge Christian dogmas. And in 1639, 3 synagogues merged, and the Sephardic community of Amsterdam was formally unified or united. In 1648, Ashkenazim from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, fleeing the ravages of the 30 Years' War, which left millions dead, which devastated the map of Europe, arrived in the city seeking refuge. They had been massacred in the infamous Cossack revolt of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Tens of thousands had fallen to the sword. And in 1675, on August 2nd, the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, as seen here on the top right, was officially inaugurated, quite simply known as the Synagogue. It is the mother synagogue of Spanish and Portuguese synagogues around the world. And as one contemporary remarked, who observed the scene that day, as seen on the bottom right, this was a day to be ranked among the happiest, which was full of pomp and ceremony, which their nation saw since the destruction of Jerusalem.
In 1656, Sephardim petitioned Oliver Cromwell, and Jews were allowed back into London for the first time since their expulsion from England in 1290. In 1701, Sephardic and Portuguese Jews opened the Bevis Mark Synagogue in London. This is the oldest synagogue in Europe and holds service for more than 300 years. At first, the Dutch New Christians had little knowledge of Judaism and had to recruit rabbis from Italy, Morocco, and Salonika to teach them. But later on, Amsterdam itself became a center of religious learning. It had taken centuries before Jews could practice Judaism openly again. Some Sephardim went west to Brazil, New Spain, Mexico, and the Caribbean islands of Jamaica and Barbados. In 1630, the Dutch conquered Portuguese Recife on the coast of Brazil. With Recife no longer under Portuguese control, the crypto-Jews came out of hiding to practice Judaism openly. They built a synagogue and imported a rabbi from Amsterdam, the first rabbi in the Western Hemisphere. But in 1654, about 25 years later, Portugal took back Brazil, and the now openly practicing Jews had to leave. The Portuguese crypto-Jews went island hopping across the Caribbean. They went to the Dutch and English colonies of Barbados, Curacao, Suriname, and Jamaica, avoiding Spanish colonies where the Inquisition was active. Here are photos of Sephardic synagogues established in Jamaica, Curacao, Suriname, and St. Thomas. It is striking that the synagogue in Jamaica was established less than 40 years after the Spanish expulsion and the discovery of the New World. And now we come to the first Jews in America.
23 Jews from Recife, famously in 1654, arrived in New Amsterdam, later renamed to New York in 1664 when the English conquered the colony. Attempting to be admitted, Peter Stuyvesant, the governor of the settlement, wrote a letter to the Dutch West India Company recommending that this deceitful race, enemies and blasphemers of Christ, be not allowed to trouble this new colony. Cognizant of their extensive business acumen and incredible trading networks, the Dutch West India Company compelled Stuyvesant to admit them, and even more, to give them permission to live, trade, and travel, and to be given their own burial ground. And once they were admitted that September day in 1654, they founded Congregation Shereth Israel, the very first congregation in North America that endures to this day. More significantly, this marks the beginning of American Jewish history.
Sephardic Jews found a haven in the United States. The concept of separation of church and state is enshrined in our Constitution, and our laws protect all citizens from an inquisition in this country. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, freedom of conscience. You no longer have to justify what religion you believe in. The Fifth Amendment, the right to remain silent. Nobody can make you confess. Sixth Amendment, you have now the right to confront your accusers and your witnesses. And the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment like the rack or the wheel. And it is thought that these were specifically written into the Bill of Rights to prevent another Inquisition in the United States. The bulk of Iberian refugees went east to the Ottoman Empire. Others went to North Africa, Northern Europe, and the Americas. The total number who emigrated was about 165,000. Total number who were baptized was about 50,000. The total number of Jews who died as a result of the expulsions is estimated at 50,000. Here's a look at the number of Sephardim today. Today, there are about 2,200,000 Sephardic Jews in the world, or about 16% of the total Jewish population. The greatest number of Sephardim are found in Israel, France, and the United States. Let's look at how the Holocaust affected Sephardic Jews in the 20th century. The European and Balkan Sephardic communities were devastated, but Jews living in North Africa had a different experience.
So the scope of the genocide, this is a map that shows you the deportation range, which essentially extends from France, Drancy was one of the major transit camps, all to the 6 death camps in southeastern Poland in particular. But the Sephardic lands are hardly represented here. Spain was technically neutral, as was Switzerland, although as we know, when you're being neutral when there is a tyrant in the room essentially means you're siding with the tyrant. But what about all the Sephardim who are living down here in North Africa? What happens to them? They largely survived the Holocaust, but only briefly. As this map shows, the vast majority of them experienced their own demographic upheaval, not at the same level as those of the Jews to the north, but they were decimated by the uprisings of their local populations upon the establishment of the State of Israel.
The longer the Nazis occupied a country, the more Jews that were killed. Rommel was defeated in North Africa, and the Nazis did not have time to destroy the Sephardic communities of North Africa. So the majority of North African Sephardic Jews survived the Holocaust. We also saw on the map that North African countries with large number of Jews expelled their Jews after 1948, when Israel came into existence. In Israel, Mizrahi Jews, who are of Middle Eastern descent, often identify with Sephardic Jews.
There are many Jews who are not of Spanish or Portuguese descent, who nevertheless identify themselves as Sephardi or Sephardi. For example, one of the greatest of the Sephardi thinkers of the 20th century is this man, Harav Ovadia Yosef, who was the chief Sephardi rabbi of Israel and really a brilliant thinker, very prolific, and he was from Baghdad. The Baghdadi Jews go back centuries upon centuries, all the way back to the Talmudic era and possibly beyond, without having anything to do with Spain directly. Nevertheless, it is their intellectual identification and religious identification with Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, who was perhaps the most famous of the Sephardi exiles, that brings them within the larger campus Sephardim. To be sure, more sophisticated discussions of ethnicity and ethnic identities would require a distinction between Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewry, or Edut HaMizrach, the Eastern communities, but many Jews who kind of attach themselves to that Sephardi intellectual religious tradition call themselves Sephardim, even though ethnically they're really more Middle Eastern than Spanish. Another interesting kind of example where you might see this is, for example, there are significant populations of non-Eastern European Chabad Jews. So they identify as Chabad, which is a very kind of Ashkenazic movement, but they are not Ashkenazim. So it's possible by way of accumulating identities that they can overlap, even though they don't necessarily make sense on a basis of nomenclature. At any rate, the Sephardim that we're talking about today are primarily those who were sent into a diaspora, but they would have a much larger impact on the indigenous populations that they encountered, as, for example, in Baghdad.
Ashkenazi Jews were prominent in the early Zionist and Israeli history. In 2000, even though Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews were 54% of the Israeli population, they believe they are still treated as second-class citizens by Ashkenazi Jews. I'm going to discuss a very unusual community of crypto-Jews who were discovered in 1917 in the hills of Portugal. This community is called Belmonte, and this is their story.
A man named Samuel Schwartz, who was a Jew from Eastern Europe, who was an engineer working in the region. And he, spoke multiple languages, was an autodidact, very interested in history and things like that. And it happened that in 1917, he was working in the region in some mines, and he was doing various things. And someone said to him, "Whatever you do, don't do business with Baltazar Pereira de Sousa." Why? Because they said he's actually a Jew. So anyway, Schwartz thought, why would you think there's a Jew here in the middle of rural Portugal? But he decided to check it out a little bit, and turns out he uncovered this crypto-Jewish community. They were quite suspicious of him at first. I bet they said to him, "Funny, you don't look Jewish." But at any rate, when he insisted on speaking with them more about this, and then he started reciting for them certain things like the Shema Yisrael prayer, they actually believed him, and they said, "Okay, I guess we can open up." This is, after all, the beginning of the 20th century, and the Inquisition, although it lasted for 400 years, is officially over at this point. So they gradually opened up to Schwartz, and he discovered this existence of a phenomenal crypto-Jewish community still active in Portugal. He wrote up his findings in several publications, which attracted worldwide attention. A lot of historians and scholars descended on the community to try to understand them better, and it's absolutely fascinating. Here's a look at the community again today. Here's the beautiful synagogue that was built there for the crypto-Jews of Belmonte, and here's the interior with the ark. It's absolutely gorgeous, really powerful statement. You can imagine praying in this beautiful space after being hidden for 500 years. Here's the mikveh, very beautiful. And they have an excellent museum there, which unfortunately doesn't have a lot of stuff online. We really got to see more of this because it is gorgeous. They have all kinds of interesting artifacts related to the crypto-Jewish practice, like this interesting funnel-like device, which was apparently designed to allow women to light candles on Friday nights and to hide the glow from neighbors who might be looking in the windows.
Let's now turn to crypto-Jews in New Mexico. In order to travel to Spanish or Portuguese colonies in the New World with the new settlers or with the conquistadors, you had to be a Christian. But along with the hundreds of thousands of Spanish Christians who came to the New World, there were also many crypto-Jews who came to the Americas to escape the Inquisition. In order to escape scrutiny by the Spanish Inquisition in Mexico City, some crypto-Jews chose to move as far away from Mexico City as possible. Looking at this map of the Spanish colonies in the New World, notice that the most northerly area of Spanish colonial control in green ended in northern New Mexico. And that's where many crypto-Jews chose to settle. Crypto-Jew families often had secret religious practices from their old Jewish heritage, which they kept hidden for centuries. Recently, crypto-Jews in New Mexico have been discovering their Jewish roots. And some of these crypto-Jews are now reclaiming their Jewish heritage. That's fine.
Today, ladies and gentlemen, what does the world of Sepharad look like in the 21st century? Well, about 15 million Jews or so worldwide, 2 to 3 million Sephardim, about 15 to 20%. 45,000 Jews in Spain, 3,000 in Portugal, but the numbers are growing. In 2015, Spain and Portugal promulgated legislation offering citizenship to descendants of the exiles as a type of compensation or reparation. And more than 200,000 applications for citizenship have come in from around the globe. And so to me, this certainly evokes a call to remember and to bear witness for posterity. This also, in the 21st century, has allowed us to bear witness and to be privileged to see the return of emerging communities of Bnei Anusim, of descendants of Jews who were coerced or compelled to convert to Christianity and were unable or unwilling to revert to Judaism in previous centuries. This was truly a hidden world, concealed for centuries from the outside. But these individuals Their descendants and communities expressed a genuine attachment against great odds to their Jewish traditions, beliefs, and memories. And in our own time, these emerging communities of crypto Jews come from Portugal, Spain, Brazil, Mexico, the American Southwest, and many other places. And so the legacy of Sepharad lives on in us as well. In 2008, a study was published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, analyzing the Y chromosome transmitted from father to son across the generations of over 1,100 men throughout the Iberian Peninsula. And startlingly, 20% are descended from Sephardic Jews, a testament to convivencia, to that golden age of Jews, Christians, and Muslims living with and peacefully, respectfully working with one another, and at the same time to the great social and religious intolerance, to the forced conversions that occurred over the centuries. Perhaps an even more groundbreaking study was published in December 2018 in Nature Communications. 6,500 people were analyzed. Their DNA was taken along the mitochondrial line and the Y chromosome. And to their astonishment, researchers found that 25% of Latin Americans have Sephardic genetic ancestry. They are descended from new Christians. And the genetics prove the historical record. In Brazil, they are descended from Portuguese. And in Central America and the western part of South America, they are descended from Spain. And not just anywhere in Spain, but particularly focused on the central and southern parts of Spain, the heartland of the biblical Sepharad. Today, there are 650 million people or so in Latin America. 60 million Latinos or Hispanics in the United States. And so if we take into account those incredible numbers, plus the 20% of modern day Iberian men who have Sephardic ancestry, the total number of descendants of Sepharad who are not Jewish necessarily, most of them are not, comes to about 200 million people around the globe. And while they are not halakhically Jewish, and while most of them may not wish to return, many of them do. And they are indeed not merely from the seed of Israel, from Zerah Yisrael, but they form an integral part of the saga of Sepharad. They are from the seed of Sepharad.
Hanukkah celebration in 2018, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the popular Puerto Rican congresswoman from New York, surprised a small crowd by announcing that she has Jewish ancestry.
My family consisted of Sephardic Jews.
Later that same week, a groundbreaking study came out of Latin America. After testing DNA samples from 6,000 randomly selected people across the region, researchers found that 23% of them had at least 5% of their DNA from Spanish Jewish heritage. Back in 2015, the Spanish government announced that they'd grant citizenship to any non-Spaniards who could prove that they are descendants of Jews who were expelled from the country in the 15th century. By late 2019, Spain revealed that they had received 127,000 applications. The most popular countries? Mexico, Venezuela, and Colombia.
I want to bring in Sonia because you have said in interviews that you always felt growing up in New Mexico, you never really felt at home in your Christian faith. You felt called by Judaism. Eventually you learned your family had hidden Jewish roots. They were conversos. Why was it hidden? Did they tell you? For so long?
No, it's a secret. Actually, I'd been practicing Judaism on my own just because I was drawn to it, and I left the church when I was 18. And I started practicing when I was about 36 on my own, and just trying to find, Jewish references, etc. Started to do my own genealogy. And
you just felt drawn to it? You didn't know for sure if you had this history?
No.
Okay.
I started in 1996 on my journey of, exploring, trying to discover, trying to find my own personal truth. And in 2004, I went to my parents to ask for a blessing to open up Bat Zion Hebrew Learning Center in Ruidoso, which I grew up Catholic there, and I didn't want to cause conflict for my family and myself. So I asked for my parents' blessings to do this center. And my dad that night not only gave me a blessing, but revealed to me the family secret that he had known he was Jewish since he was 6. So here, all this time I'd been telling them, as I discovered more and more through my own, family genealogy, trying to research that I thought we were Jews. All of our names were in the Inquisition records. And he finally is telling me in 2004.
Why? But you're going through the 70s, 80s, 90s. What were they still afraid of?
My father was 6 years old when he was forced to keep the family secret. He was born in 1938. His uncles, my great uncles, had been liberating the camps in World War II. And one of my uncles came home and told my great grandmother it was still not safe to be a Jew. And he told her the atrocities he had seen in World War II, liberating the camps and the family names he had seen in the camps. And my father heard all this, and they swore him to family secrecy.
The next to the last video, which is a minute, is Portuguese synagogue. There's no music in this. It's only a minute. So this was the synagogue that the Portuguese and Spanish Jews built in Amsterdam. It's a beautiful synagogue, and there's richness inside it. Now we're going to go to the very last video, which is a montage of synagogues that the Sephardim have built wherever they have been.
Amen, 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 Shem Nora. Amen, amen, amen. כלדיר נורא והיום לעמך תנפיות ויברך אתכם היום ואמרו כל העם אמן. כלדיר ונורא יגיל וידיר התורה ויפתח לנו שערי אורה ואמרו כל העם אמן. נקל דל שואל שבח כי עלינו לשבח בשיר מזמור למנצח ובירושלים אמן. נשיר בשיר בשבח בשיר מזמור למנצח ונאמר עלינו לשבח ואמרו כל העם אמן.
Now I turn the program over to Richard so he can tell you about next week's program. Thank you.
I've been lucky. I've been to Belmonte, so I've seen the synagogue and I've seen the museum. And the Shereth Israel Temple in New York that Sheldon references, the oldest one, just so you know, it's on West 70th and Central Park West. And the present building is not the original building. The building that's standing now that the congregation uses was built in 1896, but you can still visit it, but it's a newer building. We have one more session to go, and I just wanted to give everybody a heads up that we have a special guest speaker for next week. The gentleman's name is Ethan Marcus. He is the managing director of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America. And Ethan is a very, very smart young man. He's a Princeton graduate. He was a Fulbright scholar, and he's going to be speaking on Sephardic culture, Sephardic languages, important Sephardic personalities, and the current status of Sephardic Jewry in America. So I hope that everybody and their friends will be here next week. So we have a nice group for Ethan Marcus, and we'll see everybody for the last lecture next Tuesday at 3 o'clock.